Cool. All right. Well, my name is Eliot Lash. I will be 32 in like 10 days. I am from California, from the Bay Area. And I guess I've been kind of, I grew up in sort of like a upper middle class Jewish household, and had a very sort of like upbringing. And I also, like, one of the things that's kind of crazy too is like my dad. He is an engineer. He has like a bachelor's in electrical engineering, but he also does like computer engineering and computer programming. And he's also a doctor, so he's like this crazy, like, smart, talented dude. And when he was like in high school, he was at the first meeting of something called the Homebrew Computer Club, which, also other people in attendance included like Steve Wozniak, and other people who who used to basically started the personal computing revolution in, like, I guess this would have been like the 70s. And he was the youngest member of the club, and he designed and built his own computer from scratch, including the processor, and created his own programming language and compiler for it. So, like, really, it's kind of one of those things too, where like, like at a certain point in my life, my narrative was like, oh, I'm like a self-taught programmer. I'm like, wait, no, I'm not. Like, my dad taught me so much stuff. Like, when I was a kid, he taught me how to program IBM Basic A. And then, like, this was probably, I must have been, I don't know, like 7 or 10, something like that. We started messing around with basic programs, and I thought it was so fun. I made like a dumb, like, program where it would print out like a Google. So it was like, like a 1 with a million zeros after it. And I just thought that was so funny, like watching the zeros scroll for like 15 seconds on the screen. And stuff like that. We started making like little ASCII art things, and like, and then he also sent me to like a computer camp for like, I want to say like maybe 2 or 3 years or something, maybe even 4, where we started doing basic, and I had some friends there, and we'd like make games together as part of like the stuff we would do at camp, and using True Basic for DOS and Windows 95, I think. So yeah, I mean, and also like as a kid, I started getting into like games that came with level editors. That was like a big thing for me. So like I started making I loved Lode Runner as a kid, and like my friends, we all had like this game called Lode Runner: The Legend Returns, which is sort of like a remake of Lode Runner for Windows and Mac OS. It's a really great game, actually. It came with a level editor, so we were always like making our own levels, and like, we had like these little stories where we would try to like recreate other games, and like, it didn't really make any sense because you had to, oh, well, that's supposed to be this, that's supposed to be that, like it wouldn't, you couldn't tell just from looking at it because it was just like a Lode Runner level. But so like doing that, making like StarCraft custom maps and like custom story campaigns for StarCraft with like little cinematics and stuff. So like that was always something that I was kind of up to. I was like always interested in like playing games was like a huge thing for me, obviously, but also like I think even very early on as a kid, like getting involved as a creator with these games that, especially PC games at the time, there was a lot more like content creation tools that would come with the game, so you could make your own stuff, and that kind of like helped demystify it for me. It's like, oh, I can do this. I can make these things. I can do a bit of programming. I can do a bit of level design. And that was sort of like the entry point for me. I guess I'll stop there for a second and see if you have any questions.
No, you're good. But from there, you had I don't know, because I think sometimes like saying a career in games as if you don't go and work for like a bigger company, like it's somehow not a career in games.
Yeah.
But you went to go work for some of those companies for a time, and then now you don't.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess just like the last bit of context, however you want to sort of walk us through like how that happened and like the timeline, that would be great to hear.
Yeah, so like one of the things that happened at this camp was like I loved basic programming. It was like super fun and like intuitive to me. And then at a certain point, they're like, okay, guys, it's time for you to learn a more serious programming language. We're going to teach you C++. And I'm like, okay. And like, it just did not make any sense to me. I don't think they were like doing a very good job teaching it. And like our group had like a kid who was like kind of a prodigy. So like when I would get confused with something or like stuck, he was like, oh, I'll do it. And he just like, as I didn't like learn anything. And I'm like, oh, I guess I'm just like too dumb to be a programmer if I can't figure out this language. Cause like obviously any like good programmer could just like easily learn C++, which as an adult is just like ridiculous to me because it's like one of the most complicated programming languages of all time. I'm like, I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to teach it to kids, but yeah, that actually, like, to me, that was somewhat traumatic because I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I'm just like too dumb to be a programmer. Like, I have a learning disability in math called dyscalculia, which is like dyslexia for arithmetic. So like I already kind of had like some confidence issues about my ability to do math. I'm like, oh, well, you have to be like really good at math to be a programmer because that's like what everybody thinks. I'm like, well, I'm bad at math, so I guess I can't be a programmer. But there were a couple issues with that. One was that, like the kind of math that you're exposed to in school up until you like get to algebra and geometry is just like computation. And like, if you ask a mathematician, like how much of their day-to-day work has to do with computation, it's like none, right? Like it's just like this like, a skill that like I'm bad at. So I just thought since I was bad at computation, I couldn't understand math and I was bad at it. But like, as an adult, when I've come back to try and learn stuff, like I struggle sometimes, but I'm much like learning the concepts of and stuff that you need for game development, like trig, linear algebra, and stuff, has been a lot easier for me because you can kind of like visualize those things and like play around with them in code and like see them in much more tangible ways than just like, oh, okay, here's like some drills to do on like hand computing these like matrix multiplications or shit that you would never actually have to do in real life. So. Trying to remember where I was going with that. Oh yeah, well basically like I took like a 10-year break from programming because I like thought I couldn't do it or whatever. And so like I guess kind of when I was in high school, I was still making games, but I was more sort of like I had shifted at that point to doing like open source games and mods. So I would sort of like I would work on the content pipeline, I would do technical art, I would do documentation, I would do testing and bug reports. But I wasn't actually working on the code. And those skills were actually like super valuable to me, like going and working. I've been working on like, remote collaborative projects for so long. And that started kind of in the open source community. I had friends who were like programmers, but they didn't know how to use like Subversion, like version control. So I had to like show them, even though like I couldn't write like the Java code that they were doing, but like I could help manage the project. And that's always something that I think I've carried forward too. And so anyway, yeah, in college, I went to film school, and then I was like kind of feeling like I got to the point where I couldn't, my skills had like gone to the point where like nobody, I think I kind of got the idea that nobody would notice if I improved past the point I was, except for maybe other sound designers. So I'm like, well, that doesn't seem like a great situation because, like, why do I have a motivation to keep improving if people are already thinking my work is awesome? And, like, I know I could do better, but if they already think it's awesome, then no one will notice if it gets better. I just kind of feel like I'm sort of, like, tapping out with, like, the amount of, like, work I want to put into my craft at this point. But so I kind of got back into game development. I'm like, oh, this would be fun. I was kind of helping out with, like, design of a game that my friend was working on. I'm like, I kind of want to get back into development. So I signed up for this development class at my college. And then I'm like, hey, I want to like do audio for this game. And the teacher's like, okay, well, I'll let you waive all the prerequisites for this class because you haven't taken any CS classes. I told him I already sort of knew how to program. He's like, but you're going to have to work twice as hard as everybody else to like learn C# and catch up. And you're going to have to program. Like, I'm not going to let you join the class unless you're programming. I'm like, okay, deal. So I did that, and I'm like, shit, this is like even more fun than doing sound design for me. Like I thought I wanted to do like interactive audio stuff, but I'm like, oh, I can do that, and I can write the audio engine, and I can start working on like the level editor and like start working on the other like engine features. And I'm like, oh man, this is fun. And like to me, like programming, there's like always some new challenge that I can find and like more stuff that I can learn about. And I always like, I never want to like stop learning or improving. So it's been a good fit for me. So yeah, after that, I got like a job in like marketing, and like content and community management at a company called Tapulous, which was making a iPhone game that was really big at the time called Tap Tap Revenge, and some other stuff. So I sort of came in just trying to like get my foot in the door. My same buddy that I had like done some games with in college was like, hey, like you should apply for this job. Help me get my foot in the door there. And then I like immediately was like, okay, man, all the work that this job is supposed to be doing could be like automated with the script. So I started working on that and got some help on that with some other programmers at the company, and basically like automated myself out of a job within like a month or two. So I'm like, oh, I have all this free time, I can start programming. So I started like working on the admin panels, and the lead backend developer was like, hey, wait, you can program? You should come work for me. I'm like, okay, cool. So fast forward like a year, we managed to like get all the paperwork done, and like I officially moved over to the backend team, worked there for a year. Then I was kind of thinking about quitting, and they offered me like, I said, hey, I want to do game programming. And they're like, okay, cool, you can do game programming now. So I did that for like 2 years, working in like Objective-C, C++, Unity, C#. At Disney, I worked on a game called Tiny Death Star, which was pretty popular. It was like a Tiny Tower licensed tie-in game. And worked on some other Unity games that were like builders that got canceled. And then I kind of decided I was like fed up with working for like, we call it work. Maybe don't pronounce that, but yeah, we just sort of like, I just kind of wanted to have more creative freedom and sort of like not just be working on like essentially clones of like more popular games on the App Store instead of trying to come up with our own ideas of games. It kind of got frustrating after a while, and also just like having games that are getting canceled is not a good feeling, because like, oh great, all of my work for the last 6 months has just been thrown in the garbage and no one will ever see it. So yeah, and then I decided, I want to try like doing my own thing. So I quit. I had some savings, I lived off my savings for like a year and tried to make my own mobile game company, but after that I was sort of like, I thought this was going to be like my dream, like everybody had this dream of like, oh, I'm going to go indie and everything's going to be great. And like, it was just really hard. Honestly, the hardest thing for me was just like being so isolated, and like I was doing everything myself, and like I couldn't pay anybody. So I couldn't like, I mean, I guess I did actually pay artists on like 1 or 2 occasions, but it was like very asynchronous. And like, I think what I really realized during that time is like, I needed collaborators. I need a team. I can't just like, some people can just sort of work by themselves for like years and be fine, but like, that's not something I think I can really do. So yeah, it was hard to like motivate myself to like even keep doing prototypes. I'm like, oh, okay, I have this prototype. It's like, okay, but I don't know what to do to like fix it. I'm like losing motivation. So the only thing I actually made was like, I made this slot machine game because a friend was like giving me some business advice and was like, oh, these kind of games you can make money off of. I'm like, all right, fine. I just need like a project that I can like do. And it was actually more fun than I expected to design a slot machine game, like getting into like the math and figuring out like how likely certain things are to happen. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was sort of like, it kind of released it, and then I didn't really like want to put any money to like promoting it. So I'm like, whatever. Like, it didn't really, I think it got like 20 downloads or something. Something terrible. And then I'm like, all right, well, cool. I made like negative $2,000 on this. This is going great. And then, yeah. And then like, I was like, you know what? My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was like, you need to do something else. You're like depressed and you're not even like doing the things that you said you wanted to do. Why don't you like just go like find some contract work? So I did that for a while, and that was like, okay. But yeah, I kind of found the med tech thing, and I was like, okay, actually this seems like this might be a good change for me to actually like work on something where I feel like my work is making a difference. We're trying to create like digital prescription digital therapies for mental health that are like FDA cleared and evidence-based like therapies to help people with like addiction, opioid dependency, and insomnia and stuff like that. So that's where I've been working for the past 4.5 years, and I think it's definitely like brought the joy back into game development. Work on what I want, when I want, for the most part, just do it for fun, and like, you know, maybe get like, you know, I feel much more comfortable with the fact that like my games have like sort of a niche audience, you know, sometimes very, very small, but like if I'm able to make something that people and we can have a conversation in that way, to me that's very gratifying.
So, I mean, I know that. Yeah, no, that's great. Because I was going to ask too, although I thought I knew, because like we met 5 years ago, and then I guess like the following year you left and went into med tech, and a lot of the stuff I was expecting to ask, I think you covered. I mean, I guess like it took your wife, or maybe she was your girlfriend at the time, sort of like pointing out to you like, hey, maybe you should make a change. But I was curious, because obviously you did make a change. Like was there like a sort of a like a specific experience or like a revelation that came to you where you kind of internalized it and you were like, yeah, okay, it's time to leave, or it's time to to make a change?
Yeah, I can't remember anything specific. I think it was just sort of the combination of like, it had been a year. I had, you know, I still had savings, but it, you know, that number was obviously ticking down. I was not having a good time at all. Like, I created this company, and like I had like, you know, I was just like, you know, like, you know what, game design is hard, and like I knew I could motivate myself, like, because I think at that point I'd probably done about like 10 plus game jams, so like I knew in like a very short amount of time I could motivate myself to do a small project, and like, so that was kind of my idea with how I would do things. Like, I would just make a bunch of prototypes, kind of like a continuous jam. But like, I made one, and then I was just like, I just kind of had this like creative block. I'm like, I don't have any more ideas. I don't know how to make this thing better. And just kind of like getting depressed, and like, so. Well, I think I was sort of ready for a change at that point, because like my attempt to do, like, quote, like, live my indie dream, whatever, was obviously like a complete disaster.
Well, so I mean, since leaving, although you're still making games, I think much more on your own terms. Like, since leaving, what are you like? Do you remember like maybe what you were at first like most glad you don't have to deal with day to day anymore? Is that the same as like today, thinking back? Like, is it the same thing?
Like relative to like another game company, or for my own game company, or both?
I mean, I just mean like, since you made a change in sort of like what the bulk of your work is, you know, working in another field, like what kind of ulcers are you glad you don't have anymore from games?
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of one of those things. Like, I feel like I was always having like these creative gifts. Hey, like, I had this cool try it. You know, like, okay. My big success there was like, I got like 2 weeks to work on a prototype, and then they're like, even though like me and the designer I was working with were both like, oh, this could be really awesome, but they're just like, it was too different. You know, like, it wasn't like, they couldn't like look at the top 10 apps to like it, so like they weren't interested or something. I don't know exactly. It was weird because like the executives there were like, so like you show them like a prototype and some fucking imagination. Look at the prototype and imagine that it looks like this mock-up, and they just like couldn't do it. And like, it was just like, they didn't really understand the process of game development. It's like, oh, we need to see a vertical slice. So basically they would have teams create like a complete game, you know, vertical slice. So it would be like one level or something. But like, the amount of work and like effort required to do something like that is just like ridiculous.
Yeah.
And like, and then at the end of the day too, it's like, okay, well, we don't think it's going to be successful because we haven't seen anything that looks like this. It's like, well, it was weird to me too, because it was like, I felt like it was supposed to be like this like Disney, it's supposed to be like this creative powerhouse, right? Like they're supposed to be doing all these like original, creative movies and like all this stuff. But like at least with Disney Interactive, how it was run at the time, it was just like they're basically only interested in making clones of successful games on the App Store, with like maybe one or two exceptions. So like that was frustrating to like feel invested. Like I want to be a game developer and work. My day to day was like make a builder game, and I'm just like, I don't like, this isn't the type of game I would play. I don't even think this is a particularly good version of the builder game. It's just like a kind of like a just funny, and like I don't know. It was sort of like unsatisfying to like work on those sorts of projects. There were a few like Tap Tap Revenge. I kind of liked a bit more because like I personally would just like ribbon games more. And Tiny Death Star was kind of fun just because like Star Wars was sort of a fun property, and doing it in like a pixel art style was cool and stuff. But like I mean, I think at the end of the day it was sort of like not how I imagined it would be, like working in games. Like, oh, I love making games, so like working in the game industry would be great. I'm like, well, actually, it's just we're doing like a bunch of like work on these sort of like boring games that like aren't that fun to play, and are sort of like at a different audience and like aren't really taking any creative risks or doing anything interesting. So like that was sort of unsatisfying.
Well, you mentioned in our emails that you were. I think like the phrase you used was like you were basically quote unquote churning out reskins. And I feel like, I mean, I've never worked at one of these companies, as you know. I've listened to a lot of people who have worked at companies like these. And I mean, I guess like I hear stuff like that, but I wonder like when you're doing it day to day, and like, does it feel like you're on an assembly line? Like do most people your colleagues there, do they feel like that too? Or does no one really talk about it and you don't know?
I don't know. I mean, I would talk about it with the designer sometimes. Like I had a friend who was the designer there. And like, I guess she was more of sort of like a project management, and I think we had like some of the same issues. Like it was kind of weird too. There was like this one studio, like the Glendale studio, for some reason. Like there was, I think maybe it might have just been like a political thing too, because like the guy who his name is escaping me now, but he like did My Water. That was actually a huge commercial success, and they made it. Like that was actually, honestly, I think that was like one of the only original games that came out. It was like the design was totally original. It was like this cool thing where you could like dig these tunnels for water, and it would like have this cool water physics, and you were like trying to. It was just like a very cute game. So like I think for whatever reason they would sort of let him sort of propose novel game ideas and try them out because like he had done it before in the past, and but I don't know what. Like it was sort of like we were in Palo Alto. And just like we never really got the same sort of creative license up there.
Mm-hmm.
But like I guess it's, like in terms of the assembly line thing, I don't know. I mean, like I guess like some people like that I worked with were just like they had worked as like back end programmers at like some sort of like random business company, and they're like super excited that they like got a streak because they're like gamers, like I want to work in the game industry, but they're just like doing server programming, or they're doing the exact same thing they were doing at the last job they had, basically. So like I don't know if they necessarily cared that much about like the game itself. I don't know. Like they just seem to be like happy to be in the industry, and like there's like some cool perks that you can get working at Disney or something like that. But like for more of the people who are like working on, I guess it's sort of like I'm sort of like I'm a programmer, but I'm also very interested in design. So for me, it was sort of like frustrating to feel like as a team, like we weren't able to do anything that was like that novel, even if like, you know, I might enjoy like writing, you know, the audio engine or something. Like, you know, there's nothing really novel about a game that uses my audio engine if like the design itself is just a copy of something else.
Well, I mean, were there I mean, I guess I'm curious about like hierarchically, were there people at like, okay, so I guess like the first question is like how atomized can the work on these games get? I mean, I guess you talked a little bit about like people working on servers. Were there things that you thought not that they were beneath you, but they seemed to be even like a smaller contribution than what you were making? What was that?
Sorry, you.
Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you were breaking up as well. You didn't hear my last question?
No.
Yeah, I was just asking, I mean, so like just hierarchically speaking, I mean, I guess I was just curious if not that there was a lesser contribution to the games that you were making like below you, but like I guess I'm curious like how granular can work on these types of games you worked on get? Like, were there other roles where the work to a player might seem smaller or not even like they can't even be aware of what other people are doing on it?
For the most part, like players would not be like consciously aware of most of the stuff that goes into a game.
Yeah.
Or gameplay stuff, like how it feels, you know, what the graphics look like, you know, how much content is in the game and stuff like that. Is it, you know, obviously if it's fun, that's something that's very noticeable. But like the work of like of creating a game, like often like there's all this other stuff you have to do just to like get that stuff that is noticeable to happen, to like be possible. Like for I guess to give an example, for Tiny Death Star, right? We started with the Tiny Tower code base, which we licensed from Nimblebit, but it was written in Objective-C, and we needed, so it was only an iOS thing, and they had some other Android port, so it was like a completely separate Android code base that we didn't have access to, and it wouldn't have been useful to us really. So one of the things that I worked on and was like one of the main, was I had to port the whole code base from Objective-C to C++, from the Cocos 2D engine to Cocos 2D X, which I guess like an end user is going to like know or care about. But that was an important thing for us to do because that meant that going forward, when we implemented something, we implemented it in C++ and we could just build it to Android and iOS. And so like we probably had like 95% of our code was shared between those platforms, which for a small dev team is super important. Like we didn't have like an external team that was going to like port all of our code to Android for us. So yeah, so like things like that are like, you know, things that you spend a lot of time on and users probably don't know or care about. Yeah, stuff like the audio engine, like people like if sound wasn't in the game, people would notice. But like I know as like working as a sound designer in film too, it's like one of those things where if you do your job really well, it just seems like everything's natural.
Right.
Like people don't think about the fact that if you watch a movie, every single sound effect there has been hand placed and hand picked. And like all the, you know, dialogue has been edited together from different sources. And like if you do your job perfectly well, basically it becomes, people don't notice it. And like, that's kind of what you're aiming for. So like, I think a lot of the work in a game is kind of like that, where you like, you know, people who do it understand like the amount of craft and hard work that goes into every single aspect, but like, it might not be that noticeable to people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I wonder like, I mean, is this a common thing to sort of feel like there's little creative ownership, like working on these bigger games? Like, did you ever feel like maybe this was just an Eliot thing versus Is this a common thing that many people feel? Because that's something I
Sorry,
never really
hello?
get a sense of in these conversations. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, did you not hear my last question?
The audio sort of it's hard for me to hear. It's sort of cutting out.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just asked like, did you like? I guess I'm just curious, like, how often is there this feeling of like not having much creative ownership on working on these games? Like, is it a widespread thing, or did you feel like it was just an Eliot thing, or did you have a sense of it? Hello? Hello?
I
Hello?
still can't. Yeah, hello. I can hear that. Hello.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll ask it again. I was just curious, like, if you had a sense of like, working on games like these, like a feeling of creative ownership. I mean, was that a thing? Like, I guess I was curious, like, who tends to feel like a sense of creative ownership working on these kind of games? Did you feel like it was unusual for you to feel like you didn't have much of that?
I think working in a sort of commercial game studio, that's like pretty much the norm. Like even in like some sort of like, and I get the idea that like actually this is probably the case for a lot of studios. There may be like a few sort of like indie studios where there's sort of the exception where like everybody's super involved with the creative process and like, and all that. But I think for probably the average commercial game studio, it's kind of like you have like your little corner that you're sort of working on, and you may have input into the final product. And there are definitely some things where I'm just kind of like, I'm good. I'm just gonna do this, and like I'll see what people think. But for the most part, like you kind of need to like there's sort of a process. There's a designer and there's product managers and there needs to be sort of like a consensus, and there's certain people who are sort of like entrusted with making certain types of decisions. And so like those are the people who sort of own those decisions. And like, I think a good game designer will take input from everybody on the team, but ultimately it's like up to them how they synthesize that input into the final design. So, yeah, I mean, I think like I could definitely say, oh yeah, I had creative ownership over like the audio implementation in the game, or like the in-app purchase system. That's like another thing that I spent a lot of time on that like people don't really care about.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's sort of like I was proud of the game, like a Tiny Death Star of the game that we made there. I thought it was like pretty solid. I was very offended when somebody on the internet called it a palette swap. Because I had to like completely rewrite like all of the avatar system to allow for animated avatars, like different types of aliens, and like we had all these sort of different like new mechanics that we added to the game with like the imperial floors under the bottom of the tower that had different functions. And like I understand how like some people might say, oh, it's just like a copy, because like obviously the whole point of it was supposed to be like a version of a game that you already knew.
Right.
But I think we actually did a pretty decent job of like trying to expand on things and like trying to also just make stuff that was fun for fans. Like we tried to make sure like every planet and like every alien race was in the game, which is like a lot of Star Wars games only focus on like, oh, these are like the 5 aliens that everybody knows. So we tried to make sure there was something for everyone who are, especially like the super fans who like liked all these obscure things in the universe, and just kind of make it cute and funny.
Right.
So I was pretty proud of what it did. It's like not the sort of game that I would like normally play that much on my own, although I have actually found myself occasionally getting addicted to Tiny Tower just because it's like one of those like games with a loop. It's just like, oh, I just need to like do a little bit more optimization and then I can build another floor. It's kind of like got that addictive game loop. But yeah, it's definitely more casual than I would normally play. But I was still proud of the final product there. But yeah, there have definitely been other games too where I've worked on. I'm just kind of like, yeah, this seems like we're phoning it in or whatever.
Well, I mean, a big thing that's there's been a huge uptick of, or at least a noticeable uptick of since you left the space is just sort of, discussion of unionizing and just sort of, questioning and wondering it. And like, I just kind of feel like it's unlikely that game makers will never unionize in like a meaningful way. And so I wonder like crunch gets discussed a ton. And so I'd be curious to hear about things that are not crunch as far as like what you might feel might be the next step forward to making like, just better, just life conditions for workers, like apart from like the rare top-down initiative to increase quality of life. Like, are there other types of problems that you think are that we're able to lock horns with and that can be addressed before it comes to unionizing?
Specifically regarding like quality of life for developers.
Yeah.
Disney Mobile was kind of a special case in that, like, we sort of came out more of, like, the mobile and, like, Facebook game thing. Like, so we were, like, Disney Interactive was basically formed out of acquisitions of Playdom and Disney and Tapulous. And then there was, like, they also had, Disney Interactive already had, like, a couple mobile studios. There's one in Prague and one in Glendale.
Yeah.
And so we sort of, like, merged all the mobile studios together, under Disney Mobile, and then like all the Playdom Facebook games were just like part of like Disney Interactive, like social games or whatever. I forget what they called it, but so like I think like coming out of there, it was almost more like those companies were sort of structured a bit more like Silicon Valley startups than they were from like a traditional game studio. Like it's maybe like a fine distinction, but I think that there definitely is not the same sort of crunch culture that there were at other studios. So, like, there were definitely times where, like, hey, like, we've got a deadline coming up. Everybody needs to come in this weekend. But, like, I think those incidents were a lot more isolated than it seems to be. I've heard of projects going into, like, perpetual crunch for, like, a year or some ridiculous thing where it's just, like, I think they maybe realized that they, people kind of expected it to function a little bit more like a traditional company and like have a bit more work-life balance. Like a big company like Disney can't be like abusing and exploiting workers to this quite the same degree that like some other places might be able to get away with. I don't know if this really answers your question, but I guess like my firsthand experience with it was like my work-life balance was actually like not terrible.
Yeah.
And so like I think I don't know how much like personal experience I can bring to the table here. I do think that like this conversation is super important. I'm glad that there's like organizations out there like Game Workers Unite that are like trying to start the conversation. I think it's going to be tricky, just in general. I think like a lot of people who work in the game industry and also in the tech industry in general are being exploited, even if it's not like the super egregious abuses of like perpetual crunch or like these other things that happen. Like I think just in general, there's like this kind of unhealthy work culture where people are sort of like, this sort of like performative, I'm going to be the best worker bee. And like, people are like trying to be constantly available and like, like never taking vacations or like, so I have like a coworker too. I'm like, you're at your PTO cap, take a vacation. She's supposed to like take like 2 days off and then just like add her PTO cap again. And I'm just like, oh man, like, I think it's going to be difficult to, like, I don't know that any of sort of the issues that are like endemic to the game industry are actually like, these just seem to be sort of symptoms of this larger cultural issue where we've all been sort of like, we've all been sort of like grown up in this like capitalist kind of system where we're told, oh, this is how everything should be. And like, we have situations now where it's like, oh, this person needs sick leave, so why don't everybody like donate their sick days to this person because they're really ill and they need more sick days? Oh, isn't that nice and heartwarming how that's happening? And to me, that just seems super fucked up because companies should just give people more sick leave if they need it. Like it's just ridiculous. But
yeah,
like things like that have just become so normalized. I don't know. I think it's difficult too for like tech workers are very privileged. For the most part, they get paid pretty well. And I think people are sort of like, oh, well, I don't need, any of these sort of protections or like, I don't need to like, I'm okay. Like they just sort of get complacent with how things are and like, don't really see the kinds of abuse that happens as abuse. So I think it might be difficult to really, really sort of like get much motion there if people are sort of like who are being exploited, like don't even see what's happening to them as exploitation.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned, I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of this, I'm sure, but you mentioned this German concept of Gesamtkunstwerk.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if I know how to say it. Yeah, I came across that when I was reading like this book called "In the Blink of an Eye" by Walter Murch. It's a really good book about film editing that I found interesting. But yeah, he mentions this sort of this idea that like there's this idea that like opera was going to become this total artwork that's like this all-encompassing like media that incorporates like all of the other arts, and there's like this transcendent thing that will be like the new media of like the new century that like kind of didn't happen. Like opera basically sort of stagnated, and I think he was sort of making an argument that film was going to be the total artwork that's like incorporating all of this media. And honestly, I think like film probably has a better claim to that title than anything else at this point because it's so ubiquitous, like film and television. Like everybody watches Netflix. It's like very accessible. Mm-hmm. It's very easy like to get into and like kind of this like almost like lowest common denominator media. Like you don't even have to be literate to enjoy a film, and you don't have to have a lot of money. So I think in that sense it is. He has a point there, but I've seen people make the same argument about games, and I feel like it's just, I think like we kind of have this sort of overreaction in the game community of like, oh, like games are going to be like the transcendent, media that's like the media of the 21st century, and like it's the greatest, and you can do everything, but like actually I think like it's attempts to actually do that in games have not been very successful. And I think there is sort of like, I don't think it's like that useful to have like these sort of gatekeeper conversations, like what is and isn't a game and like what should and shouldn't be done in games. Like right. That's not really productive and just tends to like exclude, marginalized artists and stuff. But at the same time, there are certain things that honestly, I've never seen done that well in a game. It's sort of like a game that's just loaded up with cutscenes. I think like most people agree that that's like not that enjoyable of an experience, or like a game that's like just has a ton of books in it and you just spend a lot of time reading. Like I guess that's like a thing you can do. Like I love Myst, and like that's a thing that you totally have to do in Myst. but it's like one of those things too where like it feels kind of weird to just be like, oh, I'm playing a game. Okay, just kidding. I'm going to read a book for the next 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And like just the fact that we can incorporate other media into games doesn't necessarily mean that that's like the like crowning achievement of the art form, And I think that there's like certain things that games do really, really well, and that's like super interesting avenues to explore. But I think we're kind of like overreacting sometimes when we say like, because games have like such a low cultural status or have. I think that's maybe starting to change a bit. Just part of it is just like older generations are dying, and newer, like basically like all like newer generations play games in some form. So I think eventually it's just like everybody will have probably more appreciation and normalization of game playing, and it's not like going to be this niche thing anymore. Yeah. But it's like almost at that point, like, I don't think we necessarily need to like justify or like games are art. Like to me, obviously, yes, games are art because to me, anything that like an artist and like one person in the audience like thinks are art, then it's art. Like if you take a poop on the sidewalk and you're like, this is my performance art, and someone's like, oh, this is amazing. Like, okay, great. I don't really want anything to do with that, but if you think that's art, that's great. And like, so like, yeah, I mean, it's almost like the point where the term is sort of meaningless. And I guess like, I just think like we don't need to necessarily be like trying to constantly justify ourselves to the greater like cultural conversation. It's just sort of like, okay, this is the thing we enjoy, and if you don't get it, if you're like Roger Ebert, like we don't need to spend like hours debating Roger Ebert on the internet, rip. But like that was a thing that happened for a long time when he said like games can't be art, and everyone was like, oh my God, you're so wrong. And then like it's like I don't think anything really useful came out of that whole conversation. So it just sort of seems like, I don't know, maybe we should just not try to spend all of our time convincing people that like games are like this amazing thing that's going to revolutionize everything, and like have this weird like counter narrative that we're trying to like form that's probably not realistic. It's just sort of like let games be games, and like we can just enjoy them in peace. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you were talking about it being like an insecure frame, or a persistent insecure frame in games.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm curious, like, you know, in the time that you've shifted fields, I mean, is there a way that you relate to that outlook differently? Like, I mean, I don't know if you feel like you have less skin in the game, or maybe you just feel differently about that framework, or people who still espouse it.
Yeah, I think it might be related, because I definitely engaged in all these sorts of conversations that I'm now sort of throwing shade on. Like, I was like, games are art, and, you know, and like trying to, it's going to revolutionize, you know, the new thing. And I was like, you know, to watch Jane McGonigal's TED Talk and like all this stuff. And like, and now to me, it just sort of seems like kind of pointless. Cause it's sort of like, you know, the people who like aren't convinced by the argument will never be convinced by the argument. And the people who are making the argument is like, almost like you're either preaching to the choir who already agrees with you, or you're like, just don't care and never cared, or maybe just trolling and aren't actually interested in like having your mind changed by this debate. So it just sort of seems like a lot of wasted breath. I don't know.
Well, I mean, you talked about, you know, trying to live your indie dream. And I think in our emails years ago, you mentioned being inspired by, you know, Indie Game, the movie, to a degree, to embark on a career in games. So I'm curious, what did that movie not prepare you for the reality of what that dream meant?
Oh, man. Well, okay, so, like, this is very complicated, but I think, so that movie is, like, extremely problematic, and I think, like, I enjoy, it's a well-made film, and I'm glad that it got more people interested in indie games. But I think it creates this sort of heroic narrative about, which, by the way, like it features, I think, like 4 white male protagonists. So like already, just regardless of like what they're doing, it's like already like a very skewed view of like what it means to be an independent developer, because it's so centered on these like commercially successful. I mean, like it sort of pitches it as like, oh, they're not commercially successful, or they're struggling or whatever, but like, compared to a lot of other people working in the field, they're extremely well known, extremely commercially successful. Their games have critical acclaim. They have like a big sort of platform on social media. So like, it's sort of like painting them as like, oh, these are like the struggling artists, but like they don't even really, I mean, like I understand that they had like struggles and stuff, but it's sort of like, oh yeah, they're like this tortured artist, and like nobody, you know, John Blow is like, nobody understands my art, and like it's like, shut up, John Blow. Like we know, like he like is so successful, and kind of like it's kind of like this elitist as well. Like I've heard he's kind of a dick in real life, and like, you know, that's fine, whatever. But it's like we don't necessarily like need to like put these people up on a pedestal. Like everybody's human, and they have their own flaws and their own like privilege that's allowing them to come in and do these things. And like, I just think it sort of like, it sort of like weirdly sort of like decenters the lens onto this particular group of people, and sort of like creates this particular idea of what success looks like and what failure looks like that doesn't necessarily represent reality. And so like, and like, it's not just that movie too, but it's just sort of that whole culture. It's like, oh, you know, everything's about the IGF, and like, you know, everybody's dream. I had this too, like my dream is to like, you know, get a game like into the IGF, and like, you know, I've met and talked to developers who have won awards at the IGF, and that has changed nothing in their lives. And like, it's either, a lot of people say, oh, it's a free press junket, and you know, you could get some prize money maybe. But like, you know, it gets you a bit of recognition. You might get featured somewhere.
Right.
So it's basically like marketing, and it's not like it's sort of seen as like this huge like external validation that you're like this amazing developer or whatever. But like in reality, there's like a particular type of game that the IGF judges sort of bias towards. And for the most part, like, it should be pretty polished. It should be sort of like visually cool and like, have like these sort of like innovative mechanics or whatever. But like, I don't think we're going to see like a Twine game win any IGF awards anytime soon, even though like topically those games might be taking a lot more artistic risks. And, in many cases are created by people who are like marginalized and like don't have the kind of like resources and network or even funds necessarily to like even submit to the IGF. So I don't know. It's just like one of those things too, where there's like, okay, that's fine. There's like a particular sort of like platform for these types of games. But if that becomes like the only thing that people know or think about or talk about, then I think that's a big problem because it basically just erases all the other creators who have a lot less financial resources or marginalized people that, just sort of like are languishing in obscurity and like don't have, like, to me, that's actually where a lot of the really interesting work is happening. Because it's just like realistically, a lot of people don't have the time, money, resources, kind of support, whatever, to put the kind of level of polish into their games that you would expect, at that level of these games that are sort of like part of the quote conversation. I don't know.
Well, so that movie came out 8 years ago, and I guess I'm curious, like, what your sense of like how has the cult of personality sort of shifted in games or in that ecosystem of games since then?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think, there definitely has been like more and more stuff that's like come out recently of like, I had this very sort of like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, optimistic, like totally uncritical view of things, in the past. And I was like, oh yeah, these people are making all these amazing games, and like, oh, people are so cool, and I just want to like go meet them at GDC and all sorts of stuff. And then like, over time, it's just like comes out, okay, this person's an asshole. This person is like abusive. This person is like, is like racist, and like, I don't necessarily need to like name names, but I'm sure you can think of dozens of examples of the sort of thing going on. It's like, okay, actually, just because somebody makes like art that I think is good doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good person or that I should like lionize them or like treat them like royalty or whatever. And I think we just kind of have this, when I have actually had those experiences of meeting people, it's kind of like, oh wait, they're just normal people like me. And some people got lucky. They were in the right place at the right time and they made a pretty good game. And, there wasn't a whole lot of competition or like they did something that hadn't quite been done before and they just got lucky. And like, that's not necessarily, I mean, that's great. I'm happy for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean that like we need to, treat these people like celebrities, even though that's kind of like what winds up happening.
Yeah. Well, what seems to make the difference between like who gets to be successful, become one of those kind of celebrities, and who just sort of stays obscure? Is it random? Is there a criteria you can, like, is there a pattern to it?
I mean, it seems like there's like certain things, like I think that definitely privilege comes into it, because like if you're going to make an indie game, you need money. Like it takes time and effort and collaborators to make something that's like a high enough like quality bar to like get noticed in sort of the larger sphere, right?
Yeah.
So like how like you need it, like I think it just kind of comes down to a question of like how you're going to get that, right? You can get that by being someone like me who like I worked in the industry for a long time and I saved up a bunch of money and I had low living expenses and then I basically just lived off my savings for a year. But that's definitely a huge form of privilege that I was able to, like I didn't have whatever, dependence expenses, medical expenses, so much housing or expenses. I had a skill set that like I learned at a very young age because of, again, privilege.
Yeah.
That I was able to use to make a bunch of money. So like there's all sorts of stuff, like, I was living with my parents for a lot of that time too. So I didn't have to pay rent. So like, that's definitely like, not everybody has that or can get that. Right. The other thing you could do is like, I mean, you could be, you could get some sort of grant funding. I mean, like Cactus had that for a while, right? Like if you're in a country that has art grant funding, that's a way you can do it. But like, again, that's sort of like most people don't have access to that. No, you have to be like lucky, even if you are in a country that has that sort of thing. I mean, you can, like, it just sort of seems like any way you're going to go about it, like there needs to be some ability in your life to spend like discretionary time on a project that may or may not ever make money. And like, that's a luxury that I have for sure now. And that's kind of what I've been doing with my spare time. But I think like that's maybe the most important factor. And like, it's not just you, right? It has to be like all your collaborators too have to have the ability to, the other thing too is you can get a publisher, right? And your publisher can like fund part of your development. But again, in order to do that, you need connections. And to get connections, you probably need enough money to like go to conferences and meet people and start building up those relationships. So yeah, like I've seen, like projects that don't have money, it's just very hard to motivate people because it's like, things come up and like you're working on a rev share deal or something. And like, I think it's just difficult to get something done under those circumstances, unless you're like a single creator, like making something, super simple, like a twine game or something.
I mean, I saw that, I think we've talked about it a fair amount at this point, but I mean, you mentioned that sort of the novelty of, breaking in, as you put it, into the industry sort of quickly wore off. And I don't remember when you made it, but I remember seeing among the games that you've made, you made a game, you made a Passage clone. That you call Acid.
That was basically like a shit post in game form.
Well, I mean, you said it was about just sort of like the crappiness of working in the game industry. And so I feel like we've covered a lot of it, but I guess I'm just curious, like what other aspects of like working in games that we haven't touched on, like, did you find, isolating and frustrating? Because I think that's my understanding was right. That's sort of like where making that came from, that game.
Yeah. So, like, other than the ones we've discussed.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like, I guess the other thing that I would say, something that I'm even struggling with, like currently, is just like finding collaborators can be really hard. And again, it sort of can relate to the financial issues I was discussing. Like, if you're able to pay people, I think it becomes a little bit easier to be like, hey, you're a commercial artist who's very talented. Why don't I give you money and you make stuff for me? Like, that's like I think, in some cases, easier relationships to find and establish, because I think they're like, I know some artists will go out and work for RevShare, but I think it tends to be like less experienced people who don't have, as many like titles under their belts, or like are just trying to break in or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of the artists I met in the industry, like I actually, paid one of them to do art for one of my games on my indie project. Cause I'm like, look, you're a commercial artist. Like you don't need, like, you're basically kind of doing this as a favor for me and like giving me a really good rate considering how talented you are. So I will happily pay you, basically out of pocket to make some assets for my game. But, it's kind of like, again, that's like a form of privilege to be able to have the financial resources to do that. I know some people are able to get like Patreons. I guess that'd be the other thing to add, is like crowdfunding, Patreon type of thing. I know some people do that to fund their game development, which is great. But again, like in order to do that, you have to build an audience, which takes time, and you kind of have to like seed, the interest by like having enough of a thing to show off to get people to open their wallets and help fund, continuing development. So, just all this stuff is just super hard work. And, now, like, especially like going, like, as people are like, big platforms are like trying to create these streaming things where it's basically gonna be like Spotify for games, and like, just like Spotify, like creators are not really getting paid well, especially if they're making shorter experiences that people aren't spending very much time on. It's like they want you to make a game that you'll play for like 100 hours and then you'll make some money off of it. But it's just like putting really unhealthy pressures on the types of games that people are making. And obviously in this situation, the people who benefit the most are the platform holders who,
Right.
have very low marginal costs and are basically just like exploiting the work that's being done by these, marginalized creators, and like even just like mainstream creators are getting hurt by these kind of things. But it seems like, it's kind of out of our control. This is like the big tech companies, this is what they want to do. And so like, that's what's happening. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been talking a lot. I mean, as I think you expected and we discussed before I hit record, I mean, we've been talking a lot about just sort of like, issues and doubts and problems in the space. And so, I mean, obviously you have a bit of a happier ending now where you are and sort of the way you exist in games. And so I guess I'm just sort of curious, like right now, like who's kind of your North Star, or like a developer who, maybe you're taking a lot of like inspiration from, like who's someone who you think is really, doing it right and is also maybe someone we could all maybe, learn from or take inspiration from?
Yeah, man, that's kind of tough. Cause like like I said, I haven't really been following stuff super closely. I guess to me, like the people that I inspire me the most at the moment are just sort of like other developers who are working on kind of like smaller projects.
Yeah.
I personally like want I look up to JP Le Breton a lot. He is working on a bunch of Doom mods that I think are really interesting. He has like this huge project called Autobiographical Architecture, which I hope he finishes at some point. But again, like I think he's also has been very open about like, learning how important it is to like, take care of himself. And like, I think, went through some of the same struggles I did in some sense of like, working on a solo project for a long time. And so, I think like he made a really cool mod recently called Mr. Friendly, which basically turns Doom into Animal Crossing. And you can just go through all the levels in Doom and like help animals, like help the monsters, like, find lost objects and like send, notes to their secret crushes and stuff. It's very good. Stuff like that is cool to me. I'm still a big fan of Brendan Chung. I just started playing Quadrilateral Cowboy, which I'm very excited about. It's sort of like a hacking heist game. He's the guy that made like Gravity Bone. I remember that game, but
cool.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I mean, I haven't really been playing that many games recently. I started playing Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. I think also, what's his name? Joneman Nordhagen. He's like another cool developer. He seems like a very chill dude. Like, I just like, enjoy seeing developers who like you see, oh, actually this probably is a good person, and they're not like ego obsessed, and they're not like, trying to like, whatever. They're just sort of like out there doing their thing and like making cool stuff and just seem like genuinely nice people. Those are the kind of people that I like and that I want to be.
Cool. Well, I have one last question for you, unless was there something else you wanted to bring up that we didn't touch on?
I mean, I guess we didn't really talk about games journalism much, but I guess we're sort of at our time. I don't know if there's any other questions you had about that.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I'm good on time. I just never know, for people on your side of the aisle, like how interesting it is to discuss, or or how much people care, outside of people on my side of the aisle. So it never feels, I don't know, it feels less and less obligatory for me to ask, because I feel like many people feel similarly about it. But I know too that, like, I guess I sort of skipped over that because I think you said that you don't really read much anymore.
Yeah. I mean, like, I guess I like get some of the peripheral conversations that like filter. Like, honestly, these days I'm like not even on Twitter that much anymore. I'll like check it occasionally, but usually just hang out on like these niche sort of Discord communities. but like there is still some like conversation about that stuff, and like occasionally I'll like find myself reading like a post on someone's blog or like a news article, or like, you know, watching a video on YouTube or something from one of these outlets. But yeah, I mean, I'm not really like trying to keep up with this stuff much anymore, but like I do actually know, like I said, I was sort of a lot more involved with that stuff like a couple years ago, and was like, you know, on a bunch of journalist Patreons. Like this was kind of after, I forget what the thing was happening, but there was some bullshit going on that made me really mad, where like journalists were like, I think they're like getting laid off, or like something else was happening like with these publications that people were like quitting. This was like before Gamergate. So I was like got on there because I'm like, you know, this is important, and like I do think it's an important function, but I guess I kind of sort of spoke my piece about that in the email that I sent, where it's just like, you know, it seems to me like the bad things that are happening in games journalism are just sort of a microcosm of bad things that are happening in like press in general, with like funding models drying up, and like, you know, people having to like pivot more and more to just like, you know, what's going to get clicks and like ad revenue, even if that's not necessarily like, you know, the most important stuff to be talking about at any given time. So I'm sympathetic. I wish I had, you know, some sort of solution or something, but it just seems like everywhere it's kind of a bad situation. But yeah, I mean, I think like I love seeing, you know, journalists, especially who are like lifting up, you know, voices of marginalized creators and like sharing more stuff that's going on that's like maybe outside the norm of like, okay, everybody's talking about Animal Crossing, great, like, but we don't need like 500 articles about Animal Crossing.
Right.
You know, that's what people want. That's like what the people want. But I'd love to see, you know, spotlighting more on like just, oh, I found this new crazy game that like you should check out. Oh, Natalie Lawhead, that's another one that I should mention. She's really awesome. And very nice person, and also has made some like really cool, crazy games that are like very out there. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a very important function. And obviously like you can't do a write up on like every single game that gets made, because it's like, there's like millions of them, every month probably. But, it's nice to see like when that does happen. I think that's super important. And, you know, I hope that people understand the value of having a press and do more ways of like directly supporting, you know, maybe more places can get actual subscribers for individual papers, or more patrons, or some other sort of like alternative funding sources than just ad revenue that will like allow them to do more of this kind of important work.
It's tough. I mean, it's like, it's so banal and like known and cliche to say that, because I think that's another thing that has changed in the last, you know, 5 years or so, is that like it's a very widely known thing that it is tough, especially the last 5 years, where it's just sort of been a perfect storm of perfect storms, where I think it's really difficult for people in my position to sort of make the case that, like, I don't know, it feels extra, especially now that there's like a pandemic on and everything too. Even though you would think, you know, this is actually sort of like a big widespread problem that people would be hard pressed to blame on video games. That it actually would be a way for people to it would be a way to help people right now, and not in some sort of like hippy dippy way, but just legitimately it's a tool that will help us to sort of survive being stuck inside so much. You would think it would follow that there would be sort of an increased interest, but I don't think that an increased interest means that suddenly there's like funds or personnel mind space to facilitate it. So I don't know what I don't know what else to say, but I think you know that I've been sort of scraping at it for a long time, and have been doing what I've been doing here for a relatively long time as well. So I do appreciate, you know, you're expressing that at least.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, so then let me just throw this one last question to you, which is, what do you feel video games have accomplished?
Accomplish? Well, I think it's like just like toward me specifically, or just like in general.
However, I mean, whatever you feel like strongest answering.
I mean, I guess for me specifically, I feel like video games are like such a core part of my identity at this point. It's like hard to get rid of that. Like, I sort of went through a process of grieving for like, you know, my whole, like, you know, ever since I was like basically like getting out of college, I was like, oh my God, I can do this. I want to be a developer, a game developer, and like I want to be an indie developer, and like because they're doing so many cool things. Even back in like 2009, you know, that's kind of like when the indie sort of like revolution thing started happening. I'm just like, oh man, I want to make cool games like this. This is awesome.
Yeah.
And just like actually getting to the point where like technically I had got to the point where I wanted to be. And it was just like such a huge disappointment in the reality of how that actually played out from like how it happened in my mind, that, and like the cognitive dissonance of like going through and having to kind of like recalibrate my identity towards like, you know what, maybe I'm not going to be a professional game developer, and like trying to actually like be okay with that was sort of a process for me. And so I guess like for me, games are like to me, they've sort of like, they've given me this passion, a thing that I can share with my friends. It's a thing that's still forms part of my identity, and probably always will. It's like, I'm a game developer. This is a thing that's very important to me. And like, you know, even if I'm not going to make another penny off of it for the rest of my life, it's like a creative expression that I feel, it almost feels like I have to do it or I'll go crazy, you know?
Yeah.
So, and video games are like, you know, there are these games, like I'll be walking through, you know, a boardwalk in the middle of like a hardwood swamp in Florida, like where I was on vacation. I'm just like, oh man, I feel like I'm in the Channelwood Age of Mist. And these are just like thoughts that are just like permeating my head wherever I go. Like I'm always like thinking of like something will just happen. I'm like, oh man, that's just like this game. And like, even if I'm not even trying to think of these things, it's just like these things. I've spent so many hours of my life now playing games, sharing this with my friends. It's just like always with me. And I still have like in jokes with my friends from middle school where we're just like making jokes about the Journeyman project, which is like kind of weird, like this weird, like obscure thing now that people don't even know about, but it was like such a big deal for us, playing those games. And like, yeah, I mean, sorry, I guess I'm not being very coherent here, but I guess for me, like video games, there's other like big applications. Like if you read like Ian Bogo's Persuasive Games, like I think all that stuff is interesting. You know, I think games can be important ways of like sharing your personal experiences with others, and I think that's like something that's very interesting to see. Like a game like I mentioned, Autobiographical Architecture, is basically like, you know, a reflection on JP's, you know, life and growing up in Texas, and like his relationship with Doom, and the fact that he's like making the game inside the Doom engine is like really an interesting way of doing that. And it's like, it's so personal, and like such a, I think like we have, it's almost like there were like these games were like these spaces that we went to and these experiences that we had in our lives. And when you meet somebody who's played that game, you have like this sort of shared experience with them, even if you weren't in the same physical space or time. Like you shared that space and time within the game with them, and you have like a common thing that you can talk about and share. And I think it's really cool. And yeah, I think they can tell important stories, and they can allow you to experience systems and think about systems in a big picture way that's very important. But yeah, I mean, just personally, it's just kind of one of those things of like, you know, it's just always been part of my life, and I hope it always will be. And even if I nowadays don't have that much time where I choose to sit down and play games, I spend a lot of time working and making them. I think I'm still always going to want to play them too, because it's like kind of just, yeah, I don't know. Does that help answer the question?